We looked at the millenary petition last week. Now, the beginning of this week, I want to turn our attention more directly to the Hampton Court Conference. Of course, we looked some at that earlier whenever we looked at the millenary petition, but we want to get actually to the Hampton Court Conference itself. Now, one thing that is very easy to misconstrue about the millenary petition as well as the Hampton Court Conference itself is that this petition was about the translating of a new Bible. Or to say it another way, that this court was about the translating of a new Bible. And that's simply not true. I gave you a long list of some of the specific Puritan grievances in the millenary petition. And one thing that you did not find there was a reference to the translation of a new Bible. And although maybe more people know that than the other, still I think it needs to be said about both of them. Don't let this be misconstrued in your mind just because the reason that we're studying these things is because the KJV resulted from that. That was not the original thought or purpose or intent or even a suggestion in anyone's minds. Now things eventually turn in that direction because the Puritans see that they're not going to get very far with King James and this list of specific grievances. But it was called to discuss the problems between the bishops and the Puritans, between the Anglican Church and those wanting to purify the Church of England. And almost fortuitously, the King James Version of the Bible came as a result of that, as I hope you can even more clearly see from the lecture this morning. Now, as far as the outcome was concerned with regard to the Puritan cause, the conference was an almost total failure. They are wanting a revision of the liturgy and the ceremony of the Church of England. They don't like to go over a few of the things I mentioned last time. They corrupt church courts, the reading of lessons from the Apocrypha, the length of the service, confirmation, the wearing of the surplice, the wearing of the ring in marriage, Sabbath breaking, keeping of too many holy days, liturgical music, baptism by women, displaying the cross at baptism, and bowing at Jesus' name in communion. Now these are some of the things that they are opposed to, the Puritans. This is what the whole millenary petition is about, and then it is what the Hampton Court Conference is about, called to discuss, quote, things pretended to be amiss, end of quote. And with regard to the Puritan interest in that, the conference is an almost total failure. In other words, they don't get a revision of any of these 11 or 12 or however many things they're asking for. They don't get a revision of that. Whenever Reynolds, John Reynolds, he's the father of the KJV, the Puritan president of Corpus Christi College in Oxford, when his turn to speak came, then this would have been on Tuesday, Tuesday morning, then he brought up various small points in addition to what had already been discussed in the millenary petition, such as changes they desired in the Book of Common Prayer, which had been written not too much earlier. The Book of Common Prayer goes right back into, well, the century just prior to this, the 16th century. We're into the first decade of the 17th century, 1604. He felt that some of the things, or they felt, Reynolds representing the Puritan cause, that many things in the Book of Common Prayer were simply not scriptural. The prayers had too many of the trappings of Roman Catholicism still left attached, of various notions of saints and holy days. He also brought up the fact of parish living being a very impoverished form of living. Unlike people like Reverend Baker today, preaching didn't pay in those days. And to a large degree, I don't think that it really does today. Professionals in ministry are generally far below professionals in other spheres, and that's with the exception of some of the big ministries that some of you were talking about this morning. But that's another thing he brought up, improved parish living, that the Puritans as well as the Anglicans, they just did not have the money to live. And we've seen that as a plague in the church for a long time. Now, as the discussions went on between the Puritans and the bishops, King James and his 10-year-old son are just sitting there observing all of this. Now, there are, of course, breaks. This isn't a marathon-type session where you have 10 hours of discussion or something. You have to go and do your fox hunting and your wild boar hunting and all of this. And, of course, let's don't forget the feasting and the dancing. And old King Thick Tongue loved all of that more than just about anyone. So, or maybe we should say Queen Thick Tongue, to use part of a reference of their day. So there were breaks for all of these things. They discussed for a while, and then they would jump back into games and the revelry and so forth. Now, it's been questioned whether the Puritans, from one of you to me, whether the Puritans were involved in all of this. Weren't they more of a holiness separatist pious type group? Well, they were a pious type group, but yes, they were involved in this as well. They didn't really consider these things to be wrong, but rather the cultural state of their nation, of drinking and feasting and the dancing, and it was all moral. There was nothing scriptural or unscriptural about it. It was just the thing to do, just like you would maybe gather around and play some game or something. And they felt it was the thing to do. Now, the Puritans didn't like, and this was another thing brought up, didn't like the wearing of wedding rings. Now, this was not so much a view of Reynolds himself, although Reynolds was one presenting the Puritan cause before the king. It didn't bother him one way or the other, but he still brought it up because it was another point of dispute and dislike, wedding rings being required and given in marriage of the Puritan people. The four Puritan leaders, remember here, Reynolds and Chatterton and Kneestub and what was the other one? Spark, I guess. But Reynolds and Chatterton are the only two important Puritans here. The four Puritans disliked the wearing of the surplice. Now, I didn't mention that as one of the millenary petition's specific Puritan grievances, but it should really be included there. I gave you 11, and I thought there were more like 12, and here would be the 12th one. The wearing of the surplice was a religious cloak, a religious garb that was required of the clergy in England. And, of course, the Anglicans gladly wore the surplice because that showed you to be something special as a minister to get to wear an ecclesiastical garb. The Puritans were opposed to this. They're a more, down-to-earth, earthy type people who they want to do away with all of the extra baggage that has clung to the church for so long and return as much as possible, and as much as they could think in their mind at that time, to the pattern set forth in the New Testament documents. And so, since they dislike wearing the surplice, and that was one of the grievances mentioned in the millenary petition, then they slightly angered King James because they refused at this conference to wear the surplice before the king. And they wore very coarse, plain, simple clothes before him. So they start off on a bad foot, but at least they're being consistent with their own belief set. It'd be one thing to have that spelled out in the millenary petition that you're opposed to wearing the surplice, but yet you don't want to anger the king for fear that he'll reject your requests, and so you wear the surplice before him. Well, that'd be a contradiction in your own life then, to be opposed to it, but to do it so that he'll listen to the fact that you're opposed to it so that he will outlaw it. So he's slightly angered to begin with these four Puritan leaders because of the coarse, simple, plain garb that they wear. Reynolds also wanted a weakening of the episcopacy. I'm just giving you some of the general topics that took place in discussion the Tuesday through the Thursday. Reynolds wanted a weakening of the episcopacy. But James said that he had learned in Scotland, and I quote, "No bishops, no king." In other words, he felt that the bishops were some of his chief supports. And so if we rule out the episcopacy, we want to weaken the influence of the nobility. But as far as the church is concerned, if I can control the church and have the bishops as my friends, then I can control the country of Scotland, and now that he's come to England, the country of England as well. So this is what Reynolds is opposed to, this Episcopal form of government. They are more of a congregational, local church-oriented type group, the Puritan people, a local church, congregational type group. They don't like this Episcopal form of government. But James said that he had learned no bishop, no king. So in other words, it doesn't look like the conference is going anywhere. They're just throwing back little issues about wedding rings and about wearing the surplice and just throwing back these little things that I don't know that they're just tremendously important issues. I guess the important issue is just the high liturgy of the church. And so they're trying to specify by minute examples what they mean by the high liturgy. I'd be opposed to the high liturgy. But as you go through this list of wearing of the surplice and bowing at Jesus' name, you can just start getting into all types of minor disputes. The Anglicans could quote Philippians 2 to you about bowing at Jesus' name. Say, we got a verse that says we should bow at Jesus' name. So where are you going to go from there, though? Well, it's just going to be back and forth and little minute arguments that are not going to take you very far very fast. And the Puritans just kept bringing up all of these small matters, and most of them just were dismissed by the king because he favored the Anglican cause. One time in their discussions, the word presbyter was mentioned. And James confused then the English Puritans with the Scottish Presbyterians. Now there were some similarities, but remember he didn't like the Presbyterians. He was more in favor of the Episcopal form of government than the Presbyterian form. And so he's not very familiar with just who the Puritans are and what they stand for. And he just hears the name presbyter. It's a Greek term, presbyteros. He hears the name. The Puritans are not Presbyterians. Now there are similarities in their doctrine and their beliefs, but they're not Presbyterians. But he heard that name presbyter mentioned. And so he draws the link between the English Puritans and the Scottish Presbyterians, and at that point he became very, very rude to the Puritans. And he said, quote, I will make them conform, that is, to the liturgy and to the ceremonies. I will make them conform, or I will harry them out of the land, or yet do worse. So things are going downhill now in this conference as we go from Tuesday to Wednesday to Thursday. No reference to any Bibles now, but we're moving along. We're seeing that things are not going very well for the Puritan cause. Then at length, Reynolds decided to try another tactic. Now, all of these men are highly educated. None of these are imbeciles intellectually. And he spoke up, again, almost fortuitously, again on this matter. And he said, I quote, May your majesty be pleased to direct that the Bible be now translated, such versions as are extant, not answering to the original. Now, it's that one phrase, that one statement of Reynolds that's going to change the history of England and going to influence the history of the United States, because from that came the KJV. May your majesty be pleased to direct that the Bible be now translated. You can just paraphrase it. He's asking for a new Bible because the versions now available are corrupt. Such versions as are extant, not answering to the original. Now, he next then wanted to prove this statement. And so he selected only 3. When I say only, that's not very many. Only 3, what he felt, badly translated verses. I'll go over these with you and we'll see what they say. In Psalm 105 and verse 28, 2 of these come from the Old Testament, both from Psalms and one from one of Paul's epistles. Psalm 105, if you'll look in your KJV, Psalm 105, 28. This he felt was a badly translated verse. Now remember, he's not talking about the King James translation of it though, because that's what comes as a result. And what's so remarkable about some of these verses is that Psalm 105, 28 in the KJV is a badly translated verse. Now, the context here is dealing, with Egypt. Verse 24, he increased his people greatly and made them stronger than their enemies. He turned their heart to hate his people, to deal subtly with his servants. He sent Moses his servant, and Aaron whom he had chosen. They showed his signs among them, wonders in the land of Ham. Right? This is talking about the plagues on Egypt. He sent darkness and made it dark, and they rebelled not against his word. Well, the one thing the Egyptians were doing in the person of their leader Pharaoh was rebelling against God's word. And so I think what the NIV does is probably it turns it into a question there. Psalm 105:27, or 28 rather. The way we have it in the KJV doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It seems to be contradictory to the narrative of the book of Exodus. He sent darkness and made the land dark, for had they not rebelled against his words? In other words, didn't they deserve this because they had rebelled against his words? The way you got it in the KJV doesn't make a lot of sense at all. It says that, in essence, that Pharaoh and Egyptians were guiltless before the Lord. They had not rebelled against his word. So whatever this had said in an earlier translation, we're sad to say the King James translators made no improvement upon that. A second verse he selected was Psalm 106:30. And I don't know, I think I know what the problem was here, but it's what we have in the KJV is essentially what we have in the NIV. Then stood up Phinehas and executed judgment. Probably something to do with a judgment, or whatever translation he's talking about, how it translated what Phinehas did. Now we know what he did. He caught that man and that woman and ran a spear through both of their bellies into the ground. And so the plague was stayed. NIV, but Phinehas stood up and intervened. So they kind of toned down that executed judgment business. Intervened, and the plague was checked. So anyway, what we have as a result is what we have here in the KJV, Psalm 106 and verse 30. Then the other passage is over in Galatians chapter 4. I think it's verse 25, but I'll have to look it up here real quickly. Yes, verse 25, Galatians 4:25. And what we have in the KJV is a poor translation. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answereth to Jerusalem, which now is and is in bondage with her children. Now to begin with, Paul said he's speaking allegorically in verse 24. So to begin with, the passage is going to be somewhat difficult to interpret. Which things are an allegory? Verse 24. And then you make the state no better, but rather a step worse in giving us a poor translation. The marginal reading is in the same rank with. And what does the NIV have? Something like corresponds, or is similar to, or resembles, or something. Corresponds. Yes, the answereth to, well, that's what answereth to means here. But it answereth to, that it corresponds, but answereth to is not really the best translation. Now, it seems like in their day they had a little bit different meaning, or let me say it a different way, that they were more familiar with that form of speaking, answereth to versus correspond, than we are today. But inasmuch as what we have today is a poor translation, then it's a poor translation. But chief among those that's poor would be Psalm 105 and verse 28. Anyway, this is what Reynolds is asking for. May your majesty be pleased to direct that the Bible be now translated, such versions as are extant, not answering to the original. And so he selects these three verses to show the king that the Bible is just not reliable. His counterpart, Bishop Bancroft, snorted in response, I quote, "If every man's humor might be followed, there would be no end to translating." But despite the Puritan origin for the request, King James immediately liked the idea and said, I quote, "I profess I could never yet see a Bible well translated into English." Now we have a very interesting twist in the conference now. The Puritans, who were down and under, now have the upper hand. They don't have the upper hand as far as any of these other grievances are concerned. But now it at least looks like the king is slipping over to their side and going to favor their cause, at least in the sense, or in their cause of translating the Bible. King James says that I've never seen an English Bible that's been correctly translated. I've never seen a Bible well translated into English. Now, if you notice, I've been giving you a lot of direct quotes from what James said, what Reynolds said, what Bancroft said. How do we have these direct quotes? Well, we know some of the exact words because minutes were taken by several of the different people there, word by word, what took place at the conference. However, we don't have as much of that as we would like to have because most of it was lost in history. The man who took, evidently, the majority of the notes was William Barlow. He is one of the translators on the Anglican side, a hater of the Puritan cause, and we will discuss him biographically later. William Barlow, B-A-R-L-O-W. When we get to the men of the KJV, the translators who did the work, and we cover Barlow, then I'll refer you back to this and say, remember that Barlow was more or less the secretary there at the original meeting at Hampton Court. And remember where we're meeting. We had enough cloudy weather this morning so you could picture this 1,000-room mansion with gargoyles on top. Have you let that sink in? A 1,000-room home. That's just, you can't even comprehend that, a 1,000-room home. I mean, I've toured big homes like Elvis Presley's mansion, and it's just, a little cracker box. You've got maybe a few dozen rooms, maybe 50 rooms at the most. I don't remember. I doubt I don't think you've got 50 there. It's a big house, but you don't have 50 rooms. A 1,000-room mansion. You would literally get lost in there. You've been to a big museum or something trying to find, literally you have a little map they give you at the door how to find your way around. You'd have to have a map to find your way around here at Hampton Court. I just guess follow your nose. Wherever they're cooking venison, that's where you're supposed to go. All of the English court books and council registers from the years 1600 to 1613 were destroyed by a great fire. All of the English court books and council registers from the year 1600 to 1613 were destroyed by a fire at Whitehall. Two words, but put together, Whitehall. W-H-I-T-E-A-L-L. On January the 12th, 1618. The only way that we do know something are from the personal, private notes taken by William Barlow. He ends up being the secretary for the Hampton Court Conference. In other words, there was a more official rendition of the whole thing because it was part of English history. The king was involved, so that had to go into the registers of the kings and queens of the country. It was all destroyed, everything from 1600 to 1613. So we have a great lacuna there in historical documents that will document what's taking place in England during this time. A great hiatus there. And so we have to piece what happened there together from extra proper English records. So we're indebted to one William Barlow for giving us his private notes and little scribblings of what was taking place there. And we'll come back to him again later. Now we have another man who is going to give us more notes of the actual work of the translation, John Boyce. But we will come back to him later. That really fits later on whenever we discuss him. He was one of the final editors that put the whole work together. Anyway, getting back to our subject. Other issues are brought up, and the heat of the discussions just continues to go up, forcing the king to return to the one thing that appealed to him, which is a new translation. Now, the Anglicans don't like this business of a new translation. They have their bishop's Bible. Their bishop's Bible is fine for them. The Puritans, of course, had their Geneva Bible. They like their Geneva Bible, but we're several years beyond the translation of the Geneva Bible. And the Puritan leaders and the Puritan scholastics think that there are some improvements that could be made. Now, James, to show you his depthness, his cleverness, as I mentioned last time, he doesn't agree with the Puritan people. Now, he's agreeing with the new translation, but not agreeing with the Puritan people. And he didn't want them or the Anglican bishops to think that he was on the Puritans' side. And so he finished the statement that I just quoted above, where he said, I profess I could never yet see a Bible well translated into English, with this phrase, but I think that the Geneva Bible is the worst of them all. In other words, what he hands out with his right hand, he takes back with his left. What he hands out with his right, yes, we do need a Bible. He takes back with his left, because the Geneva Bible is the worst of them all. So that shows his deafness, and he's able to put one party against the other, and seem like that and seem to agree with both parties. He seems to be agreeing with the Puritans. Yes, we do need a new Bible. But he doesn't want his bishops, who are his supporters, to be opposed to him and think that he's fallen out to the enemy. And so he criticizes the Puritan Bible. The reason that we need a new one is not so much the Bishop Bible, although that can be included in his first part of the statement, I profess I could never yet see a Bible well translated into English. He twists that around by ending with, but I think that of the Geneva is the worst of them all. So it shows how clever he was. He knew how to put two parties against each other, and yet seem like he confirms both of their positions. He accepts their suggestion of the new Bible, but he took all satisfaction away from them by his stinging remark. In other words, now it looks like he's trying to turn the origin of the Bible around to his own credit, rather than the credit of the Puritan people. So he doesn't want it to appear to the bishops that he's fallen out to the enemy. And so I guess the conclusion to the whole matter of all these discussions, we're not seeing any other changes but this brought up, is that this is the only real gain for the Puritans. And for the rest of the world, I might add, for the next 350 years. That of the new Bible. After this, then, the king set up his residence in the new royal apartments in the Tower of London, the end of January and the 1st of February. And then he spent the spring many days sitting in the Lion's Tower, what was called the Lion's Tower, watching the lions tear the dogs to pieces. That's what he did for recreation. Like watching the gladiators in the old Colosseum in Rome. He watched the lions tear the dogs to pieces in the Lion's Tower in London. Now, a question I want to raise and address. Why did James agree to this new Bible? We have many different suggestions, and probably what we have in the final analysis is a combination of all of these suggestions. Why did James agree? He has done biblical work himself before, but he's a king. He's not a theologian, he's a king. Suggested by the Puritans, he doesn't want to seem like he's fallen out to the enemy side. So why go after a cause that is initiated and espoused by the Puritans? Well, here are some suggestions why James did agree at the Hampton Court Conference for this new Bible. Number one, perhaps to appear like a peacemaking man in settling the factions of the church. Now, every king, you see, every political leader wants to appease all parties within the spectrum of his constituency. So you say, well, now how does this make him look like a peacemaking man? Because the Anglicans, as Bancroft said, if every man's humour might be followed, there'd be no end to translating. The Anglicans are really not in agreement with this. Well, as soon as the Anglicans see a spark of change in the king, they're just, willing to follow. They're not going to resist the king. As soon as the king says, I think I like that. Now, when Reynolds just brought it up, well, then Bancroft snorts his retort. But whenever the king seems to agree with that, we agree with that too, that is a good idea, king. Because they're trying to curry the favor of the king as well. Everyone's trying to win everyone's favor here. And even the Puritans are involved in this shifting of allegiance and favors and so forth. Sometimes it appears like what they really want are these other grievances, but if they can't get that, we'll get whatever we can out of this conference. And a new Bible is really not the point. A new Bible is really not what they're after. Whenever we study the Geneva Bible, remember that was a famous Bible of the Puritan people. It taught them predestination. It gave them their Calvinistic doctrine, in the notes especially.
They love that Bible. So the Bible is really not what they're after. Surely these scholastics see that advances have been made in the ability to translate after several score years now, and they might think, well, a Bible could be the thing to do, but that's not the heart of the matter. They see they can't get anything else as a result of calling this conference, and they don't want to go home empty-handed. It's the old business of if you drive across town to buy something at the store and they're out, you just buy something just to make your trip over there worthwhile. And generally what you pick up is an item of waste. Here, we don't have an item of waste. It's just like, well, we're here, we might as well get something out of this conference. Just throw a Bible on the back of the wagon. And the Bible they threw on the back of the wagon to take home was the King James Version. It's remarkable how fortuitous the whole event is, and how almost by fate these things are working themselves out, when that was never the purpose, never the cause, never the heart of the matter at all. And it's not even the heart of the matter here at the conference until the very end, when all the small talk has been carried far enough and no one is going anywhere, then to get something out of it, they turn the spotlight on Bible translation. So perhaps to appear like a peacemaking man. Now we can go home from this conference with the Puritans satisfied. They were. They're going to get a new Bible out of this. At least they got something. Something you can sink your teeth into. Something you can sink your quill pen into. These scholars now have something to do for the next few years. The Anglicans are appeased because none of the grievances listed in the millenary petition are agreed to by the king. So they're happy with the outcome. All we're going to get is a new Bible. And we have more Anglican bishops and leaders than the Puritans have of their leaders. 9-1 the count is. And so we'll influence the way this Bible is going to be translated. You talk about a bishop's Bible, we'll make it even worse, better, they would say, for the Puritans worse than the bishop's Bible. The Puritans are thinking, now we'll get into this Bible, and now that it's sponsored by the king, then whatever is the result, it'll overrule the Geneva and the bishop's Bible. So we won't have two competing Bibles anymore. We'll only have one. It'll be a Puritan Bible. Do you see what both of them are thinking? Mm-hmm. Puritans say we're going to get a Puritan Bible out of this conference. The Anglicans saying we're going to get an Anglican one out of this. We won't have a Geneva's Bible to dispute with anymore. So King James makes peace. And he does it in a very clever and a very deft fashion. He makes peace. That's what type of thinker he was. Another reason I might suggest why James agreed. He had a natural inclination toward books. He doesn't like to go to war and fight battles. He likes to stay home and read and write. So his from childhood proclivity to books would be another thing that would help him agree with the Puritan desire to have a new Bible. See, you could think of some of these reasons yourself if you just think, now why would he agree with that? Here's another reason that you could also think of. Because of his exceedingly great vanity. He'd be flattered to have a Bible originated by him during his reign and carrying his name. So I would say that's probably another, maybe small, I don't know how big, but another reason why he would agree. His exceedingly great vanity. He likes the flattering thought of a Bible. He's turned it around so that pretty much he's the one who has originated this. Because the Puritans are saying, we want a new Bible because the ones that are extant don't answer to the original. And he said, that's true, particularly your Bible, the Geneva's Bible. James has got to compete during these days with other great names in world history. These are the days of Drake sailing around the world, the days of Raleigh settling America, the days of Shakespeare and his Globe Theatre, the days of Francis Bacon, who also was at Hampton Court Conference. And so James, as you well know from these names, has to compete with some luminaries in world history. And so if I'm just a king, a little thick-tongued, effeminate, homosexual king, how am I going to go down in history for anything? I'm a 37-year-old boy here. I've been on the throne since I was a boy. How am I going to go down in world history? I got to compete. Now, he doesn't know what world history becomes around people like Drake, but surely knowing that Drake is sailing around the world does something for the king. He doesn't ever get to do that. And that Sir Raleigh is settling over in America, in the United States. That Francis Bacon there is at the conference himself. Shakespeare is writing during these days, and his Globe Theater is performing. He's got great luminaries with which to compete. He doesn't have any grounds of competition. He's not a Shakespearean actor or writer. He's not of that quality, and he's certainly not a sailor like Drake, and he's not a colonial expansionist like Raleigh, and he doesn't have the mind of Bacon. So I'll inspire a new Bible and get my name attached to it, the King James Version of the Bible, and I'll soothe my vanity and stroke my ego, as they say. A fourth reason, and maybe the most important one, which is really the reason that's been brought up by both him and the Puritans, that would be the problems of the current translations. The Puritans disliked the Bishop's Bible. Do you remember why they disliked the Bishop's Bible? It had been produced by scholars of inferior abilities. There's no question about that. The men who worked on the Bishop's Bible were scholars of inferior ability. You say inferior to what? Inferior to the men who did the Geneva Bible, and inferior to the men who do the KJV Bible. So the Puritans are opposed to that Bible. The king, probably along with the English clergy, at least 9/10 of the English clergy, the king was opposed to the Geneva Bible. Now the people aren't. The people, here's a little historical note, were snapping them up as they poured off the presses in England and in the Netherlands. The Geneva Bible was gaining ground very, very quickly. It had been a strong Bible. Many of the people liked the Puritan-type tendency toward Calvinistic thought and doctrine, predestination and election and the sovereignty of God. And so people are snapping them up as they poured off the presses in England and the Netherlands. But yet we've got one group of people that don't like the other Bible, those people who don't like the first Bible, and so we have problems with translation. It just doesn't seem like, and James, he's a religious person, remember. Just about anyone born in these days, except maybe Spinoza, anyone born during these days are religious people. So we've got to have a Bible that will satisfy Christianity, Christendom, here in the United Kingdom, which becomes that later in the early 18th century, but the British Isles. But we might ask, James himself is a scholar. Remember, he wrote sonnets. He wrote something on Revelation, published numerous works by the time he was 20. He is somewhat of a scholar in his own right. Couldn't he see the deficiencies of translation in the Bishop's Bible? Couldn't he see the superiority, the quality of the Geneva Bible? Couldn't he see that? And if he could and did see that, couldn't he just pass a law that would make the Geneva Bible become the official Bible? Well, no. Number one, it was done by the Puritans, and he's opposed to the Puritans. Number two, he doesn't like the notes in the Bible. That seems to be the heart of the matter. I know that it is. We can prove this later on. This probably is the real reason right here. The notes of the Geneva Bible. The Bishop's Bible is inferior quality. King James is a scholar in his own right. King James knows that the Bishop's Bible is inferior in quality compared to the Geneva Bible. So can he accept the Geneva? No, not because it's a poor translation. It's a very good translation for that day. He cannot and will not accept it because of the Puritan Calvinistic notes. Now this has been hypothesized by some, that what he really disliked was not the translation itself, but some of its notes. But I don't think that it's so much of a hypothesis. Here's what he himself said concerning the notes of the Geneva Bible. They were, quote, very partial, untrue, seditious, and savoring too much of dangerous and traitorous conceits. End of quote. That was his thinking concerning the Geneva's notes. They were very partial, untrue, seditious, savoring too much of dangerous and traitorous conceits. He was familiar with, he didn't like Tyndale's Bible and some of his earlier notes.
especially that one on Exodus 32:35, that the Pope's bull slayeth more than Aaron's calf. He didn't like Tyndale's notes. He didn't like many of the notes that were found in the Geneva Bible. Examples? Well, here are a couple of examples. Exodus 1. I'll give you a note back here. Exodus 1, verses 15 through 22. The note found under, let's see, a verse right in the middle of this, 19. Exodus 1, verses 15 through 22. The king of Egypt. Remember, he translated the Psalms of King David by King James. You know, he's a king, so he likes and thinks of nobility and other leaders, world leaders, kings. The king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of the one was Shiphrah and the name of the other Purah. And he said, when you do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him. And if it be a daughter, let her live. But the midwives feared God, and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. And the king of Egypt called for the midwives, and said unto them, why have ye done this thing, and have saved the men children alive? Verse 19. The midwives said unto Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are lively, and are delivered ere the midwives come in unto them. And the note in Geneva Bible read as follows: their disobedience to the king was lawful, though their dissembling was evil. Now, you remember King James's concept of the divine right of kings, that the greatest sin humanity could commit against the English king would be to oppose him. That because of his doctrine of the divine right of kings, it is a hereditary kingship. The son, the daughter, has the divine God-given right and responsibility to rule that country, and B, of that divine right of kings, the second portion of that doctrine, to oppose the kingship, the monarchy, is to oppose God. And it's the worst form of opposition against God. Well, did you notice the note here? Their disobedience to the king was lawful. In other words, this implied that it would be okay for the Englishmen to disobey the king in some matters, especially in matters where he told them to disobey God. That if he told them to disobey God, they had a choice of either obeying God or obeying man. If they chose to obey God, then the Englishmen would choose to disobey the king. And they would have a proof text for it. Exodus 1:19n stands for note. GN, Geneva note. Now, they're not so much just looking at verse 19, but the note there. Of course, you could argue, and King James could have seen just from the verse itself, the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as Egyptian women, they disobeyed him. So you could get disobedience to the monarchy right here in the King James Bible. You don't have to have a note. But the note seems to pull that ancient text right down to today, to tell us what happened and why it happened, and then by implication, how that would apply to our life. Their disobedience to the king was lawful, though their dissembling was evil. Notice about that. We've discussed this passage before in Christian ethics. Did the Hebrew midwife, did they lie or not? You find many commentators, or at least some commentators, say, no, they didn't lie. They told the truth that the Hebrew women were lively and gave birth before the midwives could get there. But anyone who really reads the passage knows that they're obviously telling a bold-faced lie. If the Hebrew women are known for this, they're being so lively that they give birth, then what gave rise to midwifery in Israel to begin with? You'd never have a midwife because you know you could never make it there on time. But yet they have midwives, so they're accustomed to being able to get there and perform the duties and service of a midwife, which would mean that the Hebrew women are no more lively than any other women. So they lied. The translators of the Geneva Bible felt this, though their dissembling was evil. Dissimulation, their hypocrisy, it's deceit, it's evil. But their disobedience to the king, that was lawful and proper. So there's one note that surely King James knew about. His court ministers would make him aware of that, if nothing else. And he'd be very opposed to that. All right, now here's what we're saying. If he's opposed to that, then he's opposed to the Geneva Bible that contains it. So why doesn't he just opt for the bishop's Bible? It's of inferior translation quality. He recognizes that. The Bible of the notes of the bishop's Bible, they're okay. What notes are found. The bishop's Bible itself is not okay. The Geneva Bible itself is okay. The notes of the Geneva Bible are not okay. You have a problem with the Bible in one regard, and in the other you have a problem with the notes. Another example that I've given you earlier, and I said that we would return when we came to King James, is 2 Chronicles chapter 15 and verse 16. Concerning Asa and his mother, Semitic usage, more literally his grandmother, but 2 Chronicles 15:16, what he didn't do regarding her. Also concerning Maacah, the mother of Asa the king, he removed her from being queen, a queen mother, a queen grandmother, because she had made an idol in a grove. And Asa cut down her idol and stamped it and burned it at the brook Kidron. Now, should Asa have done something else besides this? What did the law, what did Mosaic law say for someone who made an idol? Kill his grandmother, kill his mother. Literally, she's his grandmother. Semitic usage, mother could be, descendant way back there, or ancestor way back there, rather. Kill her. Someone makes an idol, you have to put them to death. All he does is removes her from political influence and then destroys her idol, but leaves her intact, though, doesn't destroy her. Here's the note in the Geneva Bible. Herein he showed that he lacked zeal, for she ought to have died. That's true. That's a true note. Asa herein lacks zeal, for she ought to have died. Now, why would James have a problem with that? Well, he would assume that the people would think of his own mother, who had been a Roman Catholic. Now, she had been put to death by her cousin Elizabeth in England, but James had never been opposed to his own mother, because James has those Roman Catholic tendencies himself. Remember, when he came to England, he promised the Roman Catholics some privileges, and then he wasn't able to perform them. And so he incurs the ire of both the Protestants and the Catholics. Those are the two notes that are generally pulled out, and so maybe those were the two, particularly, I would say Exodus 1:19, because of his doctrine that we know that he had of the one kingdom, the spiritual kingdom view, the divine right of kings. So I think I've pointed out enough to you thus far this morning what's taking place here in the Hampton Court Conference, that it is not about translating a Bible until the very end when this is brought up. Now we're saying why James does agree. Although he doesn't agree with the Puritan people, why he does agree with their proposed Bible. In conclusion to this conference, James said, I quote a long paragraph, or a short paragraph really, I wish some special pains, this was on Thursday, I wish some special pains were taken for an uniform translation, which should be done by the best learned men in both universities, he means Oxford and Cambridge there, then reviewed by the bishops, presented to the Privy Council, lastly ratified by royal authority, to be read in the whole church and none other. That means none other Bible. Let me just read that to you again. Here's the conclusion of the conference, the only thing that comes out of the Hampton Court Conference. I wish some special pains were taken for an uniform translation, which should be done by the best learned men in both universities, Oxford and Cambridge, then reviewed by the bishops, no reference to Puritans here. They said the best learned men, and you've got Puritans on faculty here, but still reviewed after the work's been done, reviewed by the bishops, presented to the Privy Council, the king's cabinet of ministers, lastly ratified by royal authority, that would be by the king himself, to be read in the whole church, that would be Anglican and Puritan, the English church, to be read in the whole church and none other Bible. This was the first step in the production of the KJV, the most remarkable masterpiece of all of English literature.